Little Mac, this featherweight Italian-American possible mobster from the Bronx, is the protagonist of one of Nintendo's signature series, Punch-Out! He stands at only 5'7" and weighs a whopping 107 pounds, or 48.5 kilograms for our more worldly friends, and about 7.5 stone for our medieval acquaintances. Mini-Mac is a little ball of energy just waiting to smack someone in the face. Our young protagonist is just 17! He's still figuring out his body, learning the birds and the bees, asking his first date to prom. Hell, he may even still have a growth spurt left in him, assuming he really is 17. Dun dun dun! How the hell is a 17-year-old who weighs less than most preteen girls beating up guys like this? Are his competitors throwing their fights? Is Little Mac the pre-Barry Bonds poster child for steroids? No, the answer is something more insidious. But before we solve that mystery, know that within this late bloomer's heart, we find the mentality of a champion, the drive of a winner, and the soul of a legend. To find out which part of that last sentence was foreshadowing, let's revive the knocked out truths about Little Mac, and bring forth the story you never knew. There have been theories on Little Mac before, everything from Mac having a plethora of mental disorders to his entire boxing career being one big hoax. But what if none of that was true? What if Little Mac really is just a good boxer? Well, that's wrong too. Buckle your belt buckles, kids. Treesicle's about to drop some knowledge. Little Mac is a mysterious character with an ambiguous timeline. We don't even know his full name for sure. It could be Mac, but it could be Mackenzie or Maxwell. Hell, for all we know, it's Macklemore. I'm gonna pop some tags, only got $20 in my pocket. See, things are starting to make more sense now. You may think Little Mac is the protagonist of the Punch-Out series, but in reality, he's the protagonist of the Punch-Out series. Confused? Well, you should be. The Punch-Out games, despite there being 5 of them, only have 2 names: Punch-Out and Super Punch-Out. The original arcade game, Punch-Out, was succeeded by another arcade title, Super Punch-Out. Those games did so well that Nintendo decided to create another entry in the series for the NES, amazingly named Punch-Out! The next game, you guessed it, Super Punch-Out, was on the Super Nintendo. At least that one made sense! And finally, there's the 2009 title, Punch-Out, for the Wii. Hey, let's be glad they didn't name it New Punch-Out, or New Punch-Out U, or New Punch-Out 2 for you. Nintendo, get your shit together. Let's decode this mess of a timeline and figure out what it means for our tiny and, damn it, good-looking hero. Boxing hasn't messed with his jawline. Little Mac is actually in only 2 of these games, the Punch-Out games. Right. Punch-Out for the NES and the most recent version of Punch-Out on the Wii. The original arcade titles used a generic character with no name and no backstory, so not Little Mac. Simple enough, but the Super Nintendo version of Super Punch-Out makes it a bit harder to decide. One look at this blonde-haired, Trunks-inspired pretty boy can tell you that's not our Mac. But according to certain US promotional materials, that is Little Mac. However, Japanese promos never say this, and the producers of Punch-Out for the Wii claim this blonde boxer was a separate character. There's also no sign of Doc Lewis and his signature chocolate bars. I think it's pretty clear, this guy is not Little Mac. So that leaves only 2 games that include our favorite Bronx-based boxer. Let's look at the actual timeline of these games. The NES version came out first, so that seems like an obvious choice for the beginning of the timeline. But we've seen plenty of games release prequel sequels before, so it wouldn't be out of the question here. Maybe we can get some clues from Mac's stats. In the NES game, Midget Mac, Little Person Mac, is only 4'8", but in the Wii version, he's grown almost a foot, standing tall at 5'7". I guess that means the NES version came out first in the timeline. But wait a minute, he's 17? In both games? Whoa! What's going on here? Okay, maybe he had a really quick growth spurt and he is 17 in both games. Maybe there isn't meant to be a timeline here. That is possible. Or maybe the stats aren't correct. Maybe. But there's still too many unanswered questions. Questions like, how does this tiny person beat guys double his size? Except for Glass Joe, his opponents look like they could eat Little Mac for lunch. He is just a tiny Big Mac after all. Little Mac must have something on his side. Let's take a look at this pretty sweet live-action Punch-Out commercial for some evidence.
That punch cost me the WVBA title.
After 15 years, it's gonna be good to get back in the ring.
Wait, what was that? 15 years? This kid is 17! He couldn't have been 2 when he lost to King Hippo, and that means there is a timeline! The live-action Mac was clearly referring to a loss 15 years ago, in the NES version. So the events of Punch-Out on the Wii come 15 years after what happened on the NES. But that still doesn't explain how the hell this kid has been 17 for 15 years. Either somebody is lying to us, or something very strange is going on here. Are we being lied to? Let's look at the facts. First, his height. Is Little Mac really 4'8" in the NES version? The eye tells us yes. If anything, he looks even shorter than that. Going up against heavyweight fighters near or above 6 feet, Little Mac literally looks less than half their size. The Wii version checks out too. Mac does seem to be significantly taller compared to his 8-bit predecessor. A height of 5'7" actually seems pretty reasonable. But what about his age? Is Little Mac really 17 in both of these games? Besides what we're told, there's not much to go on, but we can make a decent guess based on how he looks. First, there's the fact that, as far as we can tell, Little Mac actually is 4'8" in the NES version. That height literally qualifies Little Mac as a little person, if that was his final height. But it's not. He grows to 5'7" in his next game, and since men on average stop growing by age 21, it makes sense for Mac to be a pre-growth spurt teenager on the NES. But what about the Wii version? Is it really possible for Little Mac to still be 17 15 years later? Let's take a look at him. That fit, muscular body, his perfect, definitely not balding hair, and a face with virtually 0 wrinkles on it. You're telling me this extremely attractive young man is 32 years old? And that Doc successfully passed a 32-year-old as a 17-year-old in between chocolate bars? I'm not buying it. But the alternative is even more crazy, isn't it? There's still one glaring question. How does our tiny Bronx bomber defeat such massive hulking beasts, especially when many of his opponents are among the best in the world? Let's even assume that Little Mac's age on the Wii is a lie, and that Doc is a secret genius. Who knows, maybe Mac got a lot of work done before his big HD debut. It is possible that a 32-year-old seasoned fighter was able to outbox and outsmart his bigger, stronger opponents. But that isn't possible for a 17-year-old, and that's exactly how old Little Mac is on the NES. But there is no way a brand new fighter that has barely earned his driver's license is savvy enough to outsmart stronger and bigger opponents. He doesn't have the experience. Unless he does. Because Little Mac is not aging normally. He's aging slowly. Very slowly. He's been 17 for a very long time, at least 15 years. But there's nothing to prove it hasn't been even longer. That growth spurt from 4'8" to 5'7" was just a late blooming teenager finally getting that last burst of height. We know how Little Mac defeats his opponents. He's not as big, he's not as strong, but he's got years and years of experience, even at the age of 17. And if that wasn't enough already, Little Mac does the unthinkable for a champion of a sport in his prime. He retires. At the end of Punch-Out for the Wii, Mac decides to fight until he loses 3 times. And when he does, he's done. Why would a player at the top of his game decide to quit while still in his teens? Unless he's been in his prime for years, or even decades. Calculating 15 of our years for every one of his, Little Mac is, at the very least, 255 years old. But he could be even older. There's no telling at what rate his slow growth has taken. Little Mac may be at the top of his game, but he's tired of fighting. He's lived a full life, and it's time for Mac to throw in the towel and start learning to garden like any crotchety old man. So at 17, he retires, not even a legal adult. And here Little Mac's story ends, with the wisdom of a man far beyond his years, because he is a man far beyond his years. Little Mac finds that there is more to life than punching racial stereotypes. And that's the story you never knew.
Dun, 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 dun,
Huh.